Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're tackling some pretty interesting stuff. You guys sent in this TikTok video. It's Elon Musk talking about U.S. military spending. And, normally we wouldn't just take one person's word for it, but what's really got us hooked is the comment section.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a gold mine, right? Like you get to see how people are actually reacting to this claim. And that's what we're all about, like getting that unfiltered public opinion.
Totally. And, just to set the scene here, Musk is basically saying that having 750,000 civilian employees in the U.S. military is just wasteful spending.
Right out the gate, pretty bold statement for sure. And I'm sure you saw the comment section is just a total mixed bag of, people jeering and everything in between.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's like a snapshot of how people are processing this information
Yeah.
and what's really resonating with them.
It's like a little window into, the collective anxieties about government spending and the role of the military and all that.
Okay, so let's jump into some of these comments because there are a few that really stood out. One that caught my eye was from someone claiming to be a former weapon systems developer, and they were completely backing up Musk's
Oh,
assessment.
yeah, I saw that one too. It's interesting, right? Like they're leveraging their supposed insider knowledge to lend credibility to the argument.
Yeah, and it made me wonder from an expert perspective, like, does that kind of firsthand experience actually hold any weight?
That's a great question. And it's tricky because we can't verify their claims, but their comment does raise an important point. Even if civilian employees are crucial to the military, how do we know that the current number is actually the most efficient way to do things? Could some roles be combined or streamlined, maybe?
I was wondering about that 750,000 number myself. I mean, on the surface, it seems like a lot. What sorts of roles are we talking about here?
It's really a huge range, actually. You've got engineers, scientists, data analysts, logistics, specialists, healthcare providers, even administrative staff. It's like a whole city, the military, and it needs all kinds of people to function.
So it's not just a bunch of people sitting in offices pushing papers. I mean, these are highly skilled professionals, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, many of them have advanced degrees and specialized training. They're doing everything from, developing cutting edge tech to managing global supply chains, making sure the military personnel are healthy and well taken care of.
Okay. Starting to see why it's not so simple to just, slash those numbers without considering the potential fallout. But
Yeah.
going back to that comment from the weapons developer, I mean, what kind of insights do you think someone with that experience might be able to offer?
Well, they might have seen firsthand where there's redundancy or inefficiency,
Yeah.
in procurement processes, for example, or maybe they witnessed how bureaucracy can just slow things down and end up costing more waste. Their perspective could shed some light on, the internal dynamics that contribute to this perception of waste.
Right. I mean, even if we can't take their comment as absolute truth, it's still valuable in terms of highlighting potential areas that need a closer look.
Exactly. It's a piece of the puzzle, right? It helps us understand the bigger picture. And it reminds me of another comment that caught my eye. Someone pointed out that firing military personnel isn't as easy as it sounds because many of them have these service commitments.
Oh, right. Good point. It's not like a regular job where you can just let people go whenever.
Exactly. So any downsizing efforts would have to be really carefully planned out. Taking into account those contracts, making sure the military can still do its job effectively. And then there's the ethical side of things too, disrupting people's careers and livelihoods when they've pledged to serve their country. It's complex.
Reading through all these comments, it really struck me how much anxiety there is around this idea of government waste. It's like people are just looking for any sign that their tax dollars aren't being used responsibly.
Yeah, that's a deep-rooted theme in American politics, right? It's this constant tension between the need for a strong government that provides essential services and the fear that it'll become too powerful, too inefficient, too wasteful.
And then there was that comment that totally went off the rails about the gold reserves at Fort Knox.
Oh, yeah, that one caught my eye, too. Now, it's probably a pretty fringe belief, but it's not entirely shocking to see it pop up in this context. We're talking about people's feelings about government spending. If someone's already convinced that the government is hiding the truth about something as concrete as gold, it's not that far-fetched to think they might be suspicious of waste in other areas, like military staffing.
It's like a domino effect of distrust.
Exactly. A reminder that public perception isn't always based on facts. It's often driven by emotions and deeply held beliefs.
Which makes it even more important to have these conversations right, to really unpack the complexities. So let's get back to Musk's claim for a minute. He's saying 750,000 civilian employees is a sign of excessive spending. But we've already established that those employees fill a lot of crucial roles. So is there any way to figure out if that number is actually too high?
That's where it gets tricky to make a truly informed judgment. You need a deep dive into the Department of Defense, a full audit, looking at staffing levels in each department, analyzing productivity metrics, making sure their roles align with the military's strategic goals.
Hold on, let's break that down a bit for our listeners. When you say strategic goals, what are we talking about exactly, and how do civilian jobs fit into that?
Sure. So the military's strategic goals are basically their long-term objectives, things like maintaining national security, deterring potential enemies, being ready to respond to threats around the world.
So basically protecting the country and its interests on a global scale, pretty big picture stuff.
Exactly. And civilian employees play a huge role in achieving those goals, for example. Engineers develop and maintain the technology that's needed for modern warfare analysts, provide intelligence to inform those big strategic decisions, and logistics specialists make sure the troops have the supplies they need no matter where they are in the world.
So their work is directly connected to those big goals, even if they're not out there on the front lines themselves.
Exactly, and that's why figuring out if the number of civilian employees is too high requires a really nuanced understanding of how each role contributes to the overall mission. It's not just about counting heads, you have to look at the value they bring.
It's like judging a company's success based on how many employees they have without considering what they actually do, their skills, their productivity.
Exactly. It's about understanding the whole ecosystem, not just fixating on one isolated number.
Okay, so we've got a better grasp on the context now, but let's get back into those TikTok comments, because there's one that brings up a historical parallel I think is worth exploring. This commenter mentioned Bill Clinton and how the federal workforce actually got smaller during his presidency. They were kind of implying that if Clinton could let go of hundreds of thousands of employees, then it should be doable now, too. What's the real story there?
Ah, yes, the Clinton years. It's true that the number of federal employees did go down under Clinton, but it's not as simple as just saying he fired a bunch of people. The end of the Cold War had a big impact, you see, with less global tension. There was a reduction in military personnel, which naturally affected the overall size of the federal workforce.
So it wasn't really a deliberate policy to shrink the government. It was more like a side effect of what was happening on the world stage.
Exactly. And there was another factor at play during Clinton's time. There was this push to outsource certain government functions to private companies. That shift also contributed to the decrease in the number of people directly employed by the government.
Makes sense. It's funny how a comment like that can make it seem like such a straightforward issue, but
Yeah.
when you actually dig a little deeper, there are all these historical and political layers to consider. It's a good reminder not to fall for those overly simplistic narratives, especially on social media.
Absolutely. Context is everything. And speaking of context, there's another thread in the comments that brings up a really interesting aspect of government spending. It's this idea that agencies feel pressured to spend all the money they're given, even if they don't actually need it. This spend it or lose it mentality. It's been a topic of debate for years.
Yeah, I've heard that phrase before. The idea is that if an agency doesn't use up its entire budget, they'll get less funding the next year. Is there any truth to that? How does the whole budgeting thing work in government?
Well, it's not quite as simple as use it or lose it, but there is some truth to that concern. Government agencies usually have to justify their budget requests based on what they spent the previous year. If they consistently underspend it, can raise some eyebrows, make people question whether they really need that much money and potentially lead to cuts down the line.
So it creates this weird incentive to spend everything just in case.
Yeah, you could say that it's a complicated system with a lot of moving parts, and those incentives don't always lead to the best outcomes.
I'm sure our listeners thinking, okay, but how does all this budgeting back and forth affect me? What does this potential spend it or lose it dynamic mean for taxpayers?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If agencies are pressured to spend money just for the sake of spending, it means those funds might not be going towards the things that are most important or providing the best value for taxpayers.
So it's potentially less about what's best for the country and more about protecting their own budgets.
It's not always that cynical, but yeah, the way the system is set up can definitely create that risk.
Okay, that makes sense. It seems like transparency and accountability are super important here. If we want to make sure our tax dollars are being used wisely, we need to be able to track how that money's being spent and hold agencies accountable for their decisions.
Couldn't agree more. Citizens have every right to know how their money is being used and to demand that the people in charge are acting responsibly.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. We've gone from a single TikTok video to a deep dive into government spending, military staffing, historical context, even the ins and outs of budgeting. What are some key takeaways you think our listeners should walk away with today? I feel like we just scratched the surface here. This whole thing started with Elon Musk and military spending, but it feels like we've stumbled onto this much bigger question about, how we as citizens should be thinking about government spending in general.
Absolutely, you're right on the money. This isn't just about one TikTok video or one specific agency. It's about developing this critical thinking when it comes to how our tax dollars are being used, no matter what the area is.
So you're saying if we're worried about waste in the military, we should be applying that same level of scrutiny to other areas of government spending too.
Exactly. Think healthcare, education, infrastructure, social programs, all these areas where huge amounts of taxpayer money are being spent. And in each one, you're going to find these debates about efficiency, effectiveness, and whether those funds are truly serving the public good.
It's like that saying, follow the money. If we want to understand how things really work, we got to understand where the money's going and why.
Precisely. And that's
Wow.
where our listeners come in. This isn't just about passively listening. It's about becoming informed and engaged citizens, asking tough questions, demanding accountability.
Okay, so let's give our listeners some concrete steps they can take. What's the most important thing they can do to make sure their tax dollars are being used responsibly?
Well, the first step is to stay informed, read news from different sources, pay attention to government budgets and spending reports, and don't be afraid to really dig into the issues that you care about.
So don't just take things at face value, do your own research.
Exactly. The second step is to engage with your elected officials, reach out to your representatives and senators, go to town hall meetings, and speak up about your concerns regarding government spending.
Make your voices heard.
Absolutely. And lastly, never underestimate the power of community. Talk to your friends, your family, your neighbors about these issues. Start a conversation, share information, and work together to hold those in power accountable.
Collective action. That's what it's all about. It's easy to feel powerless when you're dealing with these huge, complex systems. But we forget that we as citizens have a lot of power when we work together.
That's a great point to wrap up on. Remember, this isn't about being cynical or negative. It's about taking ownership of our role in the democratic process, making sure our government is truly working for the people.
Well said. And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you the tools to engage with these issues in a meaningful way. Remember, knowledge is power, but only when it's put into action. Until next time, happy diving.